Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of the night, where mysteries unfold like petals in moonlight, where the past whispers its secrets through gaslit corridors, and where sleep finds you gently amid the unfolding of extraordinary tales. I am here to guide you through a story tonight, one designed not to startle or disturb, but to cradle your thoughts as they drift toward rest. Let the tensions of your day dissolve like mist beneath the morning sun. Tonight, we journey together to Victorian London, to that most famous address, where rain patters against foggy windows and a fire crackles with gentle persistence in the hearth. I wonder, as you settle into this moment, where in this vast world you find yourself listening. What corner of the earth claims you as darkness falls or morning breaks? Wherever you may be, you are welcome here. Now settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling over London for 3 days without cease, a persistent autumn deluge that turned the cobblestones of Baker Street into mirrors reflecting the amber glow of gas lamps. It was the kind of rain that seemed to have no beginning and promised no end, merely existing as a constant companion to the lengthening shadows of October 1893. Inside the rooms at 221B, the atmosphere held a particular quality of warmth and sanctuary that only such weather could create, a cocoon of golden light and comfortable stillness set against the grey wash of the world beyond the windows. Sherlock Holmes sat in his customary armchair, the one positioned closest to the fire, his long frame arranged in that peculiar attitude of repose that those who knew him recognized as the outward manifestation of intense mental activity. His eyes, half-lidded, watched the flames dance and leap, while his fingers formed a steeple beneath his chin. The firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, casting shadows that shifted with each flicker and spark, transforming his aquiline profile into something almost sculptural in its stillness. Across from him, I, Dr. John Watson, had abandoned my afternoon newspaper to the small table at my elbow, finding greater comfort in simply watching the rain trace its endless patterns down the window panes. The rhythmic sound of water against glass had become a kind of music, punctuated occasionally by the settling of coals in the grate, or the distant rumble of a hansom cab navigating the wet streets below. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea not 20 minutes prior, and the porcelain pot still radiated a gentle warmth beneath its quilted cosy, the scent of Earl Grey mingling with the tobacco smoke that hung in lazy spirals near the ceiling. "You are restless, Watson," Holmes observed without moving, his voice carrying that particular quality of quiet certainty that made even his casual observations sound like pronouncements. "You have turned the same page of that newspaper 4 times in the past 10 minutes, yet I suspect you could not recount a single word of what you appeared to be reading." I smiled despite myself, reaching for my teacup and finding it had grown lukewarm in my distraction. "Merely wool gathering, Holmes. The rain induces a certain melancholy, does it not? Or perhaps a philosophical turn of mind. Rain is merely precipitation, my dear fellow. The melancholy it induces is entirely a projection of our own internal states upon the external world." He shifted slightly, his gaze moving from the fire to the window, where rivulets carved their paths through the condensation. Though I confess, there is something about such weather that makes the mind turn inward, toward reflection and memory, rather than forward momentum and action. The clock on the mantelpiece, a gift from a grateful client some years before, ticked with methodical precision, marking the passage of this grey afternoon toward evening. Soon, Mrs. Hudson would bring fresh tea and perhaps some of her excellent seed cake, and the evening would settle around us like a familiar blanket, comfortable and known. It seemed unlikely that anything would disturb this peaceful interlude, this island of calm in the great churning sea that was London. How wrong such assumptions proved to be. The sound, when it came, was so soft that at first I thought I had imagined it. A gentle tapping at the street door, barely audible above the rain. Holmes, however, sat upright, with the sudden grace of a cat that has sensed movement in tall grass, his entire demeanour transforming in an instant from languid contemplation to sharp attention. "A visitor," he murmured, his eyes brightening with that particular gleam I had come to associate with the prospect of a new problem to engage his formidable intellect. And one who approaches with considerable hesitation, if the pattern of that knock is any indication. We heard Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the hall below, her muffled voice raised in greeting, though the words themselves remained indistinct through the floor. Then came the measured tread of someone ascending the 17 steps to our rooms, a slow, careful ascent that spoke of either great age or great weariness, perhaps both. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to stand before the fire, assuming that position of casual readiness that allowed him to assess any newcomer with his customary thoroughness. I found myself sitting straighter, my journalist's curiosity awakened, despite the soporific effect of the rainy afternoon. The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson appeared, her kindly face bearing an expression of concern. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, this is Lord Ashworth. He has come through terrible weather and seems quite distressed. I have asked him to take some tea." She stepped aside, and into our warm sanctuary came a figure who seemed to carry the chill of the rain with him, despite being relatively dry. Lord Ashworth was a man of perhaps 60 years, though his bearing suggested someone older. His shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with his sodden overcoat, which dripped quietly onto Mrs. Hudson's carefully maintained carpet. His face was distinguished, but drawn, with deep lines bracketing a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile, and his eyes, pale grey like the sky beyond our windows, held a haunted quality that no amount of firelight could entirely dispel. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice a cultured baritone roughened by emotion, "I apologize for calling upon you without appointment, and in such inclement weather besides, but I find myself in circumstances so peculiar, so deeply troubling, that I could think of nowhere else to turn." Holmes gestured toward the chair I had vacated, which sat in the warmth of the fire's glow. "Please sit, Lord Ashworth. Mrs. Hudson, if you would be so kind as to bring fresh tea, and perhaps something warming for his lordship. The evening grows colder, and he has clearly endured quite a journey." As our landlady departed with murmured assurances, Lord Ashworth settled into the chair with the careful movements of one whose physical comfort has become irrelevant in the face of mental anguish. He removed his gloves slowly, and I noted that his hands trembled slightly. Whether from cold or nerves, I could not immediately determine. "Now then," Holmes said, resuming his own seat and regarding our visitor with that intense but not unkind attention he reserved for clients in genuine distress. "Tell us what has brought you to Baker Street on this grey October evening. Take your time, and omit no detail, however insignificant it may seem." Lord Ashworth drew a breath that seemed to require considerable effort, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Before you fall asleep, I would be curious to know what time it is where you find yourself, and from what corner of the world you listen to this tale. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he began, I serve Her Majesty's government in a capacity that requires the utmost discretion. For the past 20 years, I have held a position within the Home Office dealing with matters of state security. Matters that I am sworn never to discuss outside the most protected circles. But something has occurred, something that defies all rational explanation, and I fear it may threaten not merely my position or my reputation, but perhaps something far more fundamental to the safety of this realm. He paused as Mrs. Hudson returned with a fresh pot of tea and a small glass of brandy, which she pressed into Lord Ashworth's hands with maternal insistence. He accepted it with a nod of gratitude and took a small sip before continuing. 3 weeks ago, a series of documents went missing from a secure facility within Whitehall. Documents that detail certain arrangements between Her Majesty's government and foreign powers. Agreements that must remain secret for the stability of Europe. The room from which they were taken is accessible only to myself and 2 other officials, and it is guarded night and day. There are no windows, no other means of entry, and yet the papers vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers forming that characteristic steeple beneath his chin. And you suspected. At first, simple theft, though the security measures made even that seem improbable. But then came the first letter. Lord Ashworth reached into his coat pocket with shaking hands and withdrew a folded sheet of heavy paper, yellowed at the edges and bearing an odd scent, something acrid and organic that made my nose wrinkle. It was found on my desk at the Home Office, placed there despite the fact that my office had been locked throughout the night, and the building itself was under full guard. Holmes took the letter with the delicate grip he reserved for important evidence, unfolding it carefully and holding it toward the firelight. I moved closer to read over his shoulder, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The message was brief, written in an archaic hand that seemed to belong to another century entirely. The demon of Whitehall watches. What was hidden is revealed. What was sealed is opened. The blood debt seems due. Beneath this cryptic message was drawn a symbol, a complex geometric design that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering firelight, though I knew this must be merely a trick of shadow and flame. It resembled no seal or crest I had ever encountered, yet something about it stirred an uneasy recognition deep in my mind, as if I had glimpsed it before in some half-remembered dream. There have been 3 more such letters, Lord Ashworth continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, each one appearing impossibly in secured locations, each bearing similar messages about debts and demons and things hidden in the foundations of Whitehall itself. And Mr. Holmes, 2 nights ago. He faltered, taking another sip of brandy as if to fortify himself. 2 nights ago, I woke in my own bedchamber to find one of these symbols drawn upon my wall in what appeared to be ash or charcoal, though no trace of either substance could be found anywhere in the room. The fire crackled suddenly, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated our small gathering in sharp relief, before fading back to the steady glow. Outside, the rain continued its endless percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its sound muffled and melancholy through the damp air. Holmes sat in silence for a long moment, his grey eyes distant as he processed this remarkable narrative. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that edge of excitement he could never entirely suppress when confronted with a truly singular problem. Lord Ashworth, you have presented me with a most intriguing puzzle, one that combines elements of the material and the apparently supernatural in ways that demand investigation. I must ask, does the phrase blood debt hold any specific meaning for you? Any connection to your family history, or the history of the building itself? Our visitor's face, already pale, seemed to lose what little colour remained. Whitehall, he said slowly, stands upon ground that has known many purposes over the centuries. There are foundations beneath foundations, chambers and passages that predate the current structures by hundreds of years. And there are, he hesitated, there are stories, old stories, dismissed as superstition and legend, about what was done there in darker times. The room seemed to grow colder, despite the fire's warmth, and I found myself drawing my chair slightly closer to the hearth, seeking comfort in its glow. Holmes, however, appeared energized rather than disturbed, his entire being focused on the mystery unfolding before us. Then we shall have to delve into those foundations, both literal and historical, he declared. We shall uncover what truths hide beneath these layers of legend, and we shall discover who or what seeks to unsettle you with these theatrical displays. He rose from his chair and began to pace, his movements fluid and purposeful, the firelight throwing his shadow large against the wallpapered walls. The investigation, it seemed, had begun in earnest, and the peaceful grey afternoon had given way to something altogether more intriguing, a mystery wrapped in symbols and secrets, waiting to be unravelled thread by careful thread as the rain continued to fall over London and darkness gathered in the corners of our warm, lamplit rooms. Holmes moved to the window, the letter still held delicately between his fingers, angling it toward what remained of the day's fading light. The rain had softened to a fine mist now, transforming Baker Street into an impressionistic painting where gas lamps bled their golden halos into the gathering dusk. Behind us, Lord Ashworth remained seated, the brandy glass cradled in both hands as though it were a talisman against the darkness of his thoughts. "Watson," Holmes said, without turning from the window, his voice carrying that particular tone of controlled intensity I knew so well. "Would you be so good as to bring me the magnifying lens from my desk, and the small leather case beside it, the one containing the chemical testing strips?" I retrieved the requested items, noting as I did so the careful organization of Holmes's workspace, a deliberate arrangement that belied the chaos it often appeared to contain. When I returned, he had spread the letter carefully upon the small table near the window, smoothing its creases with movements of surprising gentleness. Through the lens, the paper revealed its secrets in increments. Holmes bent close, his breathing shallow and controlled, examining first the texture of the material itself, then the ink, finally the peculiar symbol that seemed to pulse with its own malign life in the wavering light. "The paper is of considerable age," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Perhaps 50 years or more, though it has been well preserved. The ink, however, is far more recent, no more than a month old, I should judge. An interesting contradiction, suggesting someone with access to antique materials, but contemporary purposes. He produced one of the testing strips and touched it carefully to the edge of the ink. The paper darkened immediately, shifting from white to a deep purple. Iron gall ink, traditional formulation. Our correspondent either possesses a romantic attachment to historical methods or wishes to create that impression. Lord Ashworth stirred in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. But the symbol, Mr. Holmes, have you seen its like before? I have searched every reference book in my considerable library and found nothing that resembles it. Holmes straightened, his eyes distant with thought. The symbol itself combines elements from several traditions: alchemical sigils, hermetic geometry, and what appears to be a corrupted form of seal magic from the Solomonic tradition. Yet, it is none of these things precisely. Rather, it seems designed to evoke a sense of ancient and forbidden knowledge while remaining fundamentally unknowable. He paused, turning to face our client fully, which suggests to me that whoever created it possesses considerable learning and a flair for the theatrical. They wish to unsettle and intimidate, and they have succeeded admirably in your case. The fire popped suddenly, sending a small cascade of embers onto the hearthstone, and I moved to sweep them back with the brass poker, the metal ringing softly against the grate. The familiar domestic sound seemed to restore a measure of normalcy to the room, grounding us against the strangeness of the mystery we confronted. I must know more about Whitehall's history, Holmes continued, resuming his seat and pressing his fingertips together in that pyramid of contemplation. You mentioned foundations beneath foundations, chambers that predate the current structures. Can you be more specific? What exactly lies beneath the offices where you conduct Her Majesty's business? Lord Ashworth set down his empty glass, his hands now steadier, as though giving voice to these long-buried concerns somehow diminished their power over him. The current palace of Whitehall is but a shadow of what once stood there. Most of the old palace burned in 1698, you understand. But before the palace, there were other structures still. The site has been occupied since Roman times, and there are crypts and cellars that extend down through layers of history like geological strata. Some are known and mapped. Others are merely rumoured, spoken of in documents that may themselves be nothing more than medieval fancy. And these rumours, Holmes pressed gently, they speak of what exactly? Our visitor rose and began to pace, drawn by some restless energy that had been building throughout his narrative. He moved to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines without seeing them, seeking perhaps some physical anchor for memories that clearly disturbed him. There was a period, he began slowly, during the reign of Henry VIII, when certain experiments were conducted. The king's break with Rome had created a vacuum of spiritual authority, and into that vacuum rushed all manner of scholars and charlatans, mystics and madmen. John Dee himself maintained chambers within Whitehall for a time, conducting his investigations into angelic communication and the structure of reality itself. Holmes leaned forward with undisguised interest. Dee, yes, of course, the Queen's own astrologer and a mathematician of considerable genius. Whatever one may think of his more esoteric pursuits, and you believe these chambers still exist? I know they exist, Lord Ashworth replied, turning from the bookshelf with an expression that mingled fear and fascination. I have seen them myself, years ago, when I first took my position. A senior official showed me, a sort of initiation into the deeper mysteries of the place where I would spend my days. They lie 3 levels beneath the current basements, accessed through a door that most believe leads merely to storage. The rooms are sealed now, have been for decades, but they remain, and they are... He hesitated, seeking the right words. They are not empty of atmosphere, shall we say. One feels, standing in those cold stone chambers, that one is not entirely alone. The clock chimed the half-hour, its delicate mechanism marking the passage of time with mathematical precision, while we sat surrounded by talk of ancient mysteries and impossible thefts. Mrs. Hudson appeared briefly to refresh the teapot, her presence a welcome reminder of the ordinary world that continued to exist beyond the boundaries of our increasingly strange conversation. She poured fresh tea into our cups, the amber liquid steaming gently, releasing its bergamot perfume into air already thick with tobacco smoke and firelight. After she departed, Holmes sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, his eyes half closed, processing the information Lord Ashworth had provided. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that quality of decision that marked the transition from information gathering to action. "We must see these chambers," he announced, "and we must examine the room from which the documents were stolen, as well as your office where the letters have appeared. Lord Ashworth, can you arrange access to Whitehall for myself and Watson? Preferably at a time when we might conduct our investigation without attracting undue attention." "The building never entirely sleeps," our client replied, returning to his chair as though the movement of confession had exhausted him. "But it grows quieter in the evening hours, after the clerks and secretaries have departed. I could arrange for you to enter tonight, if you are willing. There is a side entrance used by senior officials, and at this hour we would encounter few others in the corridors we must traverse." Holmes was already moving toward his bedroom, calling back over his shoulder. "Excellent. Watson, I suggest you bring your service revolver, though I anticipate we shall require it more for psychological comfort than practical necessity. Whatever we face tonight, I suspect it will prove more amenable to reason than to bullets." I retrieved the revolver from my desk drawer, checking its chambers with the automatic precision of old military habit, though I shared Holmes's assessment that we were unlikely to face physical danger. Still, there was something about the nature of this mystery, the impossible appearances of letters, the symbols drawn in ash, the atmosphere of dread that surrounded Lord Ashworth like a shroud, that made the weight of the weapon in my pocket reassuring. By the time Holmes emerged from his room, he had exchanged his mouse-coloured dressing gown for a dark suit, appropriate for a nocturnal visit to the halls of government, and had added to his person various small tools, whose purposes I could only guess at. Lockpicks, perhaps, or instruments for taking impressions and measurements. His eyes shone with that peculiar brightness that difficult cases always kindled in him, the excitement of a mind presented with a puzzle worthy of its capabilities. "Lord Ashworth," he said, shrugging into his coat with economical movements, "I must ask one more question before we depart. These missing documents, their disappearance was discovered how, exactly? By you personally, or by another?" "By myself," came the reply. "I had gone to retrieve them for a scheduled review, and found only empty space where they should have been. The room showed no signs of disturbance, no indication that anyone had entered since I had last been there 3 days prior. And the two other officials who possess access to this room, do you trust them implicitly? Lord Ashworth drew himself up with visible offence. Sir Edmund Blackwood and Lord Chancellor Pemberton have served the Crown for a combined 60 years. I would stake my life on their loyalty and discretion. Holmes held up a placating hand. I meant no aspersion on their character, merely gathering facts. The impossible nature of this theft suggests either extraordinary method or inside assistance, and we must consider all possibilities, however unpalatable. He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back with an expression of mild curiosity. One final detail, the documents themselves. What precisely did they contain? For the first time since entering our rooms, Lord Ashworth smiled, though there was no humour in the expression. That, Mr. Holmes, I cannot tell you. Not will not, cannot. Even to speak of their contents outside the most secure circumstances would violate oaths that I hold more sacred than my own life. I can tell you only that their loss presents a danger to the realm, and that they must be recovered before they fall into hands that would use them to destabilize the very foundations of British power. Then we must recover them, Holmes stated simply, as though announcing his intention to post a letter rather than prevent a potential catastrophe. Come, Watson, the game is afoot, as I believe I have been heard to say upon previous occasions of similar gravity. We descended the stairs in single file, Lord Ashworth leading the way, his shoulders squared now with purpose rather than bowed with dread. In the street, his carriage waited, black and anonymous in the misty evening, the horses stamping impatiently against the wet cobblestones. The driver, a solid figure in a caped coat, touched his hat in silent acknowledgement as we approached. As I settled into the leather interior, breathing in the scent of old wood and older money, I caught a glimpse of Baker Street receding behind us, our windows still glowing warmly against the gathering night. Then we turned onto a broader avenue, and the familiar comfort of our rooms disappeared, swallowed by the anonymous darkness of London's evening streets as we travelled toward Whitehall, toward secrets buried in stone and time, toward mysteries that waited in chambers sealed against the light of day. The carriage wheels sang their rhythmic song against whetstone as we travelled Deatstone, as we travelled deeper into the heart of London, each turn taking us further from the comfortable domesticity of Baker Street, and closer to the labyrinthine corridors of power that constituted Whitehall. Through the window, I watched the city transform around us. The residential streets, with their cheerful lighted windows, giving way to broader thoroughfares lined with imposing edifices of government and commerce, their facades rendered mysterious and monumental by the settling darkness and persistent mist. Holmes sat across from me in the carriage, his profile occasionally illuminated by the passing gas lamps, each brief flash of light revealing features set in an expression of intense concentration. He had withdrawn into himself, into that interior landscape where he assembled facts and observations into coherent patterns, building mental architectures of deduction that would guide our investigation. Lord Ashworth, seated beside me, stared out at the passing streets with eyes that saw, I suspected, not the present moment, but rather memories of those sealed chambers he had described, those cold stone rooms where the past pressed close like fog against glass. The scent inside the carriage was a mixture of leather and wool, of tobacco from Holmes's pipe, and the faint trace of Lord Ashworth's cologne, something old-fashioned and woody, cedar perhaps, or sandalwood. These familiar smells created a cocoon of normality, even as we journeyed toward circumstances that defied normal explanation, and I found myself grateful for their grounding presence. "Tell me, Lord Ashworth," Holmes said, suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence. "These letters that appeared in impossible locations, were they always found in the morning, or at other times as well?" Our companion shifted, turning his attention from the window to my friend. "Always in the morning, when I first arrived at my office, as though whoever placed them there worked under cover of darkness, though how they managed to enter secured rooms remains utterly inexplicable." "Not inexplicable," Holmes corrected gently, "merely unexplained. There is a profound difference between the two states. Inexplicable suggests the impossible, while unexplained indicates only that we have not yet discovered the mechanism by which the possible was achieved." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes catching the light. "And the symbol drawn on your bedchamber wall, was it large or small, precisely rendered or crude in execution?" "Perhaps a foot in diameter," Lord Ashworth replied after a moment's consideration. "And the execution was meticulous, perfect in its geometry, as though drawn with instruments rather than freehand. That precision somehow made it more disturbing. It spoke of deliberation, of someone standing in my private chamber, taking their time to create this mark, while I slept mere feet away, unconscious and vulnerable." A shiver passed through him, despite the relative warmth of the carriage, and I felt an echo of his unease. There was something particularly violating about the idea of an intruder in one's bedroom, that most private of sanctuaries, especially an intruder who came not to steal or harm, but merely to leave a cryptic message. The carriage lurched suddenly as we turned onto Whitehall proper, the wheels finding a patch of uneven cobblestones, and we all swayed with the motion. Outside, the great buildings of state loomed against the darkening sky, their windows mostly dark at this hour, though here and there a lighted room suggested civil servants, labouring late into the evening over matters of empire and administration. We came to a halt before an unremarkable door set into one of these massive facades, a side entrance, as Lord Ashworth had promised, far from the grand public portals with their ceremonial guards and constant traffic. The driver remained on his box, a silent sentinel, as we descended to the pavement. The mist had thickened during our journey, lending the street an otherworldly quality, muffling sound and obscuring distances, so that we seemed to exist in a sphere of reality, isolated from the ordinary world. Lord Ashworth produced a key from his waistcoat pocket, an ornate brass affair that looked as though it had been cut in an earlier century, and fitted it into the lock with the ease of long practice. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow corridor dimly lit by gas fixtures that burned low, creating more shadow than illumination. The air that flowed out to meet us carried the scent of old paper and stone dust, of beeswax polish, and the particular mustiness that accumulates in buildings where history has been conducted for centuries. "This way," Lord Ashworth murmured, his voice instinctively dropping to match the hushed atmosphere. "We shall take the back stairs to my office first, where I can show you the most recent letter, and then descend to the vault where the documents were kept." We entered single file, our footsteps echoing softly against marble floors worn smooth by generations of passage. The corridor stretched before us, lined with portraits of stern-faced men in ruffs and wigs, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress with expressions of permanent disapproval. Holmes paused before one such portrait, tilting his head to read the small brass plaque affixed to the frame. "Sir Francis Walsingham," he read aloud, "Elizabeth's spymaster, a man who understood the value of secrets and the methods necessary to protect them. I wonder what he would make of our present mystery. A theft from a locked room, letters appearing as though conjured from air, symbols of power drawn in darkness. He would likely have had the perpetrator drawn and quartered," Lord Ashworth replied with grim humour, "and then investigated the method afterward. Those were less subtle times." We climbed the back stairs, a narrow spiral of worn stone that rose through the building's interior like a chambered nautilus. The gas fixtures here were fewer and farther between, creating pools of light separated by stretches of near darkness through which we passed like travellers moving between oases in a desert of shadow. Our breathing grew slightly laboured with the ascent, and the temperature seemed to drop with each turn of the stair, as though we climbed not upward but somehow down, deeper into cold stone and older time. At the third landing, Lord Ashworth led us through another door into a corridor markedly different from the one we had entered below. Here, the walls were panelled in dark wood, and the floor was carpeted in deep burgundy, muffling our footsteps to whispers. Doors lined both sides of the passage, each bearing a small brass nameplate, though in the dim light I could not read most of them. The atmosphere was thick with silence, the kind of profound quiet that accumulates in places abandoned by their daytime occupants, and I found myself acutely aware of every small sound: the rustle of our clothes, the creak of floorboards beneath the carpet, the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the building's depths. "My office," Lord Ashworth announced, stopping before a door indistinguishable from its neighbours, save for the nameplate that read, "Lord Ashworth, Senior Under-Secretary." He withdrew another key, and I noticed that his hand trembled slightly as he fitted it to the lock. The door swung open, and Lord Ashworth reached for the gas valve on the wall just inside, turning it until the overhead fixtures bloomed into warm light. The office revealed was exactly what one might expect of a senior government official. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a massive desk of dark mahogany, comfortable chairs arranged before a small fireplace, and windows that would, in daylight, offer a view of the street below. Everything spoke of order and permanence, of decisions made and policies implemented across decades of faithful service. Yet, there was something wrong with the room, some quality of disturbance that my senses registered before my conscious mind could articulate it. Holmes evidently felt it too, for he stood very still in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the space with that peculiar intensity that suggested he was cataloguing not merely what was present, but what was absent or misplaced. "There," Lord Ashworth said, pointing to the desk where a single sheet of yellowed paper lay precisely centred on the leather blotter. "It was there when I arrived yesterday morning, though I had locked this room myself the previous evening, and the door showed no signs of tampering." Holmes crossed to the desk with quick strides, producing his magnifying lens from a pocket and bending to examine the letter without touching it. I moved to join him, peering over his shoulder at the now familiar archaic script and disturbing symbol. This message read, "The foundations remember what the walls have forgotten. The sealed door shall open. The seeper beneath awakens." The symbol beneath it was the same geometric nightmare we had seen on the previous letter, though rendered, if anything, with even greater precision. Looking at it made my eyes water slightly, as though the angles involved somehow violated the normal rules of visual perception. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "do you note anything particular about the placement of this letter?" I studied the desk more carefully. The letter lay perfectly centered, as Lord Ashworth had said, but more than that, it was positioned so that the symbol aligned exactly with an ornate brass fitting set into the desk's surface, a decorative element that, upon closer inspection, bore a resemblance to the symbol itself, though in simplified form. "The desk," I said. "The symbol and the desk ornament, they correspond." "Precisely." Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful, which suggests our mysterious correspondent is intimately familiar with this office, familiar enough to notice a detail that most would overlook in years of daily use. "Lord Ashworth, how long have you occupied this room?" 15 years, came the reply. And I confess, I had never particularly noticed that brass fitting until this moment. It was simply part of the desk's decoration, inherited from my predecessor along with the rest of the furniture. Holmes moved to examine the bookshelves, running his fingers along the spines, occasionally removing a volume to check behind it, or to fan the pages in search of hidden documents. The gaslights hissed softly, their steady flame creating a gentle ambience that seemed at odds with the tension of our investigation. A sudden sound made us all freeze, the distinct creak of a floorboard somewhere in the corridor outside, followed by another and then another, marking the slow approach of footsteps. Someone was walking toward Lord Ashworth's office, their tread measured and deliberate, drawing inexorably closer through the darkened hallway beyond the door we had left slightly ajar. The footsteps drew nearer, each measured tread marking time, like the pendulum of some unseen clock counting down toward an encounter we could neither predict nor prevent. Holmes moved with silent efficiency toward the door, positioning himself where he might observe the corridor without being immediately visible to whoever approached. I found my hand moving instinctively toward the pocket where my revolver rested, though I made no move to draw it. Not yet, perhaps not at all, but the gesture itself provided a measure of comfort against the unknown. Lord Ashworth had gone quite pale, his earlier composure crumbling as the reality of our situation, standing in his office after hours, investigating mysteries that touched upon state secrets, suddenly presented itself in the concrete form of an unexpected visitor. His mouth opened as if to speak, but Holmes raised a warning finger to his lips, and our client fell silent, hardly daring to breathe as the footsteps came closer still. Then, just as the walker must have reached the very threshold of the office, the footsteps stopped. We waited in frozen tableau, 3 men suspended in anticipation, listening with every fibre of our beings for what would come next. The silence stretched, became oppressive, filled the room like water rising in a sealed chamber. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, and the gentle hiss of the gas lamps seemed suddenly thunderous. A shadow fell across the strip of light, visible beneath the door. Someone standing just outside, motionless as we were motionless, separated by mere inches of wood, and yet existing in entirely different spheres of awareness. What did they know? Had they heard us? Were they even now deciding whether to enter, to confront us, to raise an alarm that would bring guards running through these quiet corridors? The shadow shifted, moved away, and the footsteps resumed, growing gradually fainter as whoever had paused outside Lord Ashworth's door continued their mysterious journey through the darkened halls of Whitehall. We remained frozen for several heartbeats after the sound had faded entirely, scarcely crediting our apparent good fortune. "A night watchman, perhaps," Holmes whispered, finally relaxing his vigilant stance. "Making his rounds. Or possibly another official working late, though at this hour that seems less likely. In any case, they have passed us by, and we should take advantage of this reprieve to continue our investigation with all possible speed." Lord Ashworth released a breath he seemed to have been holding since the footsteps first began, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Yes, of course. The vault. We should proceed to the vault before anyone else happens upon us." Holmes returned to the desk, carefully lifting the letter by its corners and holding it up to the light for one final examination. "This paper," he murmured, more to himself than to us, "has been handled frequently, yet bears remarkably few fingerprints. Our correspondent is either uncommonly careful or wears gloves, probably the latter, given the precision of the symbol's execution. And the ink, while recent, has been applied with an old-fashioned nib, not a modern pen. Someone with an appreciation for historical detail, or someone attempting to create that impression." He produced a small envelope from his pocket and slid the letter carefully inside, sealing it with movements that suggested long practice. "We shall examine this more thoroughly in proper light, with proper equipment. For now, Lord Ashworth, lead us to this vault of yours, and let us see what secrets it may yet reveal." We extinguished the gas lamps and returned to the corridor, which seemed darker now than it had before, as though our brief sojourn in the lighted office had made our eyes less tolerant of shadow. Lord Ashworth led us not back toward the spiral stair we had ascended, but rather deeper into the building, through passages that turned and twisted with no apparent logic, creating a maze through which only long familiarity could provide reliable navigation. The character of the architecture changed as we walked, the relatively modern panelling giving way to older stone, the gas fixtures becoming more sporadic, until we relied as much on the small lantern Lord Ashworth had retrieved from his office as on any fixed lighting. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying scents of earth and age that spoke of depths below depths, of spaces cut from living rock centuries before the current structures had been raised above them. We came at last to a descending stair, broader than the spiral we had climbed earlier, but far more ancient, its steps worn into gentle curves by countless feet over countless years. There was no railing, only bare stone walls pressing close on either side, and our shadows danced huge and grotesque across those surfaces as the lantern swung with Lord Ashworth's measured descent. Down we went, and down further still, the temperature dropping noticeably with each level we passed. The stairway seemed to spiral into the very bowels of the earth, and I found myself counting steps, 20, 30, 50, losing track eventually, as the descent continued far beyond what I had anticipated. My breath began to show faintly in the lantern light, pale wisps that dissipated quickly in the cold, still air. Finally, the stairs ended in a small landing before a heavy wooden door bound with iron straps that had begun to rust at their edges. The door bore no lock that I could see, only an iron ring for a handle. Yet Lord Ashworth paused before it with an expression of marked reluctance. "Beyond this door," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space, lies the vault level. The specific room where the documents were kept is at the far end of a corridor, past several other storage chambers. I must warn you, the atmosphere below is peculiar. Many refuse to work here for any length of time, claiming the place unsettles them. Superstition, Holmes declared, though I detected a note of anticipation beneath his dismissive tone. The mind creates phantoms when presented with unfamiliar sensations. Nevertheless, we shall proceed with appropriate caution. Watson, I trust your revolver is readily accessible. I patted my pocket in confirmation, and Holmes nodded satisfaction. Lord Ashworth grasped the iron ring and pulled, the door swinging outward with a deep groan of metal on metal that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. A rush of cold air flowed past us, carrying an odd mixture of scents. Dust and mildew, certainly. But beneath those familiar smells, something else. Something acrid and organic that I could not immediately identify. The lantern light revealed a corridor carved directly from bedrock, its walls rough-hewn and weeping with moisture that had accumulated over what might be centuries of neglect. The floor was uneven, sloping slightly downward, and small puddles had collected in its depressions, reflecting our lantern like scattered mirrors. The ceiling was low enough that Holmes, tall as he was, needed to stoop slightly to avoid striking his head on the occasional protruding stone. We proceeded in single file, our footsteps splashing softly through the shallow water, the sound multiplying in echoes that made it seem as though we were accompanied by an invisible host of followers. Every few yards, we passed doors set into the stone walls, heavy oak barriers reinforced with iron, each bearing a small brass plate indicating its contents. Records, 1702-1715. Military correspondence, 1688-1699. Treasury documents, 1670-1685. The dates grew progressively older as we walked, as though we travelled not merely through space, but backward through time itself, toward origins and foundations that predated the modern state. The corridor branched occasionally, dark side passages leading off into unmapped darkness, and from these openings came faint draughts of air that made the lantern flame gutter and dance. Once, I thought I heard a sound from one of these passages, a soft susurration like fabric dragging across stone. But when we paused to listen, only silence answered, thick and waiting. "Here," Lord Ashworth said at last, stopping before a door that appeared no different from the dozens we had passed. "This is the secure vault. Only 3 keys exist, held by myself, Sir Edmund Blackwood, and Lord Chancellor Pemberton. The room is opened only when absolutely necessary, and a log is kept of every access." He withdrew a key from the chain he wore about his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, and I noted that this key was different from the others he had used, smaller, more intricate, its teeth forming a complex pattern that suggested a lock of unusual sophistication. It turned smoothly in the mechanism, and the door swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a small chamber, perhaps 12 feet square. The room was empty, save for a single wooden cabinet against the far wall, its doors standing open to reveal empty shelves where documents had presumably once rested. But it was not the cabinet that drew my immediate attention. It was the symbol. There, drawn upon the stone floor in what appeared to be ash or fine charcoal, was the same geometric nightmare we had seen on the letters, rendered on a scale that made it dominate the entire room. The symbol was perhaps 8 feet in diameter, its intricate lines and angles filling the available space with mathematical precision. Standing at the threshold, looking down upon it, I felt a wave of vertigo, as though the floor had suddenly tilted beneath my feet, threatening to spill me into some abyss that existed just beyond the edge of perception. Holmes stepped carefully around the symbol's perimeter, his eyes tracking its every curve and intersection, his mind clearly racing to extract meaning from this elaborate display. Extraordinary, he breathed. The precision involved, the time this must have taken to create, and all done in a supposedly secure room with no evidence of how the artist entered or departed. He knelt at the symbol's edge, producing his magnifying lens and examining the material from which it had been drawn. Not charcoal, he murmured after a moment, and not ash from any ordinary fire. This substance has an unusual consistency, almost waxy, yet it leaves no residue on the fingers. He touched it carefully, rubbing thumb and forefingers together. Remarkable. A sudden sound from the corridor made us all start. A scraping, dragging noise, distant but growing closer, as though something heavy were being pulled across the rough stone floor. The scraping sound ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving in its wake a silence so profound that it seemed almost to have weight and substance, pressing against our ears like water at depth. Holmes, like water at depth. Holmes remained kneeling beside the symbol, one hand still extended toward its mysterious substance, but his entire body had gone tense with alertness, every sense focused on that now silent corridor from which the sound had emanated. Lord Ashworth stood frozen in the doorway, his lantern held high, though his hand trembled enough to set shadows dancing wildly across the rough stone walls. I withdrew my revolver, the metal cool and reassuring against my palm, and moved to position myself where I might observe the corridor, while still maintaining some protection from the vault's doorframe. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat seeming loud enough to echo through these subterranean passages, yet I forced my breathing to remain steady, drawing upon old military training that had never entirely left me despite years of civilian practice. Rats, perhaps, Lord Ashworth whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. These lower levels sometimes harbour. Holmes raised a silencing hand, his head cocked at an angle that suggested he was listening not merely with his ears, but with some deeper faculty of perception. For perhaps a minute we remained thus, three statues arranged in tableau of anticipation, waiting for the sound to resume, or for something to emerge from the darkness beyond our small pool of lantern light. Nothing came. The silence persisted, grew heavier, became almost oppressive in its totality. Even the faint drip of water that had accompanied our walk through the corridor seemed to have ceased, as though the entire underground realm held its breath in sympathy with our own suspended animation. Whatever it was, Holmes said finally, rising from his examination of the symbol with fluid grace, it has either departed or chosen to remain concealed. Neither possibility should deter us from our investigation, though both suggest we proceed with heightened awareness. He brushed dust from his trousers with absent gestures, his mind clearly occupied with matters beyond such mundane concerns. Lord Ashworth, you say only 3 individuals possess keys to this vault. When was the last time it was opened prior to your discovery of the theft? Our client consulted a small leather-bound notebook he produced from his coat pocket, angling it toward the lantern light to read its entries. According to the access log, which I retrieved from upstairs before we descended. The vault was last opened 18 days ago by Sir Edmund Blackwood, who was conducting a routine audit of the holdings. Before that, Lord Chancellor Pemberton accessed it 23 days prior. My own previous visit was 31 days ago. And between Sir Edmund's visit and your discovery of the theft, a span of how many days? 4 days. The theft must have occurred during that window, though how anyone could have entered without one of the 3 keys remains utterly baffling. Holmes moved to examine the door itself, running his sensitive fingers along the frame, the hinges, the lock mechanism. He produced a small torch from his pocket, one of those clever modern electric devices, and played its beam across the metal surfaces, searching for scratches or other evidence of tampering. The bright white light seemed almost violent after the soft gold of the lantern, harsh and unforgiving in its revelation of detail. "The lock shows no signs of picking," he announced after several minutes of meticulous examination. "No scratches on the pins, no displacement of the internal mechanisms. If someone entered this room during those 4 days, they did so either with a key or through some other means entirely." He turned his attention to the walls, moving methodically around the small chamber, tapping the stones with his knuckles, listening to the subtle variations in sound that might indicate hollow spaces or hidden passages. I watched this process with familiar patience, having witnessed Holmes conduct similar examinations on numerous previous occasions. There was something almost meditative about his thoroughness, the way he gave himself entirely to the physical investigation, allowing his hands and ears to gather information that his eyes alone might miss. The vault had grown colder during our occupancy, or perhaps I had simply become more aware of the chill, and I found myself wishing for the warmth of the fire we had left behind at Baker Street, the comfort of familiar surroundings, rather than these oppressive stone chambers that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. A soft exhalation from Holmes drew my attention. He had paused at the rear wall of the vault, his fingers tracing a line in the mortar between 2 stones. "Watson, bring the lantern here, if you would." I crossed the chamber carefully, stepping over the symbol rather than through it, some instinctive reluctance to disturb the pattern, despite knowing it was merely lines drawn on stone. Up close, holding the lantern where Holmes indicated, I could see what had caught his attention. A hairline crack in the mortar, barely visible, running vertically for perhaps 3 feet, before turning at a right angle and continuing horizontally. "A seam," Holmes murmured, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction that marked the discovery of a significant clue. "See how it forms a rectangle? This is not natural settlement or aging. This is a deliberate construction, a panel or door set into the wall with such precision that it becomes nearly invisible unless one knows to look for it." He pressed against the stones at various points, searching for a mechanism or release. Lord Ashworth had moved to join us, his earlier fear apparently overcome by curiosity, and together we examined the wall while the lantern light played across its rough surface, seeking some indication of how this hidden panel might be opened. It was Lord Ashworth who found it, a small protrusion of stone at shoulder height that appeared to be merely a natural irregularity, but which, when pressed firmly, yielded with a soft click. The rectangular section of wall Holmes had identified swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a passage so narrow that we would need to proceed single file, a tunnel cut through the living rock that sloped downward into darkness our lantern could not immediately penetrate. Cold air flowed from this opening, carrying with it that same odd scent I had noticed earlier, acrid and organic, vaguely unsettling in its unfamiliarity. The draught made the lantern flame gutter wildly, and for a moment I feared it might extinguish entirely, leaving us in absolute darkness in these depths beneath Whitehall. But the flame recovered, burning perhaps less brightly than before, but maintaining its essential function of pushing back the dark. Extraordinary, Lord Ashworth breathed, staring into the revealed passage with an expression that mingled wonder and dread. I have worked in this building for 20 years, have been shown secrets that most will never know, and yet this I never suspected existed. Holmes had already produced his electric torch and was directing its beam into the passage, illuminating rough-hewn walls that bore the marks of tools far older than any modern implement. "This tunnel predates the current structures by centuries," he observed. "See the tool marks? Those were made by hand chisels, not mechanical drills. And the angle of descent suggests it connects to some deeper level, perhaps to those chambers you mentioned earlier, the rooms where John Dee conducted his investigations." "We are going down there," I said, the statement requiring no interrogative inflection, for I knew Holmes well enough to predict his next action with reasonable certainty. "Of course we are," he confirmed, that familiar gleam of adventure lighting his eyes. "How could we not? A hidden passage discovered in a vault from which documents were mysteriously stolen. The connection is too obvious to ignore. This is how our thief entered and departed, Watson. This is the solution to the locked room mystery." He stepped into the passage without hesitation, and Lord Ashworth and I followed, drawn by a mixture of duty, curiosity, and the simple momentum of investigation that propels one forward, even when prudence might suggest retreat. The passage was indeed narrow. My shoulders nearly brushed both walls as I walked, and the ceiling so low that Holmes needed to stoop considerably to avoid striking his head on the rough stone overhead. The descent was gradual but continuous, a gentle slope that nonetheless conveyed us steadily deeper into the earth with each step. The walls wept with moisture, and occasionally I felt water drip onto my head from some unseen source above, cold droplets that traced icy paths down my collar. Our footsteps echoed strangely in this confined space, creating acoustic effects that made it difficult to judge distance or orientation. After what felt like several minutes of descent, though time had become difficult to gauge in this windowless realm, the passage widened slightly, and the ceiling rose to a more comfortable height. Holmes paused, playing his torch beam across the walls, illuminating crude symbols carved into the stone. Not the complex geometric pattern we had seen in the vault, but simpler marks, crosses, and circles, and what might have been letters in some archaic alphabet. "Protective sigils," Lord Ashworth murmured, reaching out to trace one with a hesitant finger. "I have seen similar marks in medieval grimoires, symbols meant to ward against evil spirits or malign influences. Someone who worked in these tunnels felt the need for supernatural protection." Before Holmes could respond, the passage ahead erupted in sudden sound, a tremendous crash of metal on stone, followed by a cascade of smaller impacts, as though something large and complex had fallen or been deliberately overturned. Gauged word count and orchestrated narrative momentum strategically. The echo of the crash reverberated through the passage, multiplying and distorting until it seemed to come from all directions at once. A cacophony that assaulted our ears and set our nerves jangling. I raised my revolver instinctively, though what good bullets might do against an unknown threat in these confined quarters remained questionable. Holmes stood perfectly still, his torch beam directed toward the source of the sound, though the passage curved ahead, preventing us from seeing what lay beyond. Should we not retreat? Lord Ashworth asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking at normal volume might somehow attract unwanted attention. If someone is down here, someone who knows these passages. If someone is down here, Holmes interrupted, then they are the very person we seek, and I have no intention of losing this opportunity for confrontation. Besides, that sound did not strike me as human in origin. Too chaotic, too random. Something fell or collapsed, but whether by accident or design, I cannot yet determine. He moved forward with renewed purpose, and we followed, because the alternative, remaining alone in these dark passages, or attempting to retrace our steps, seemed somehow worse than facing whatever lay ahead. The curve in the passage revealed itself gradually as we advanced, and as we rounded it, Holmes's torch illuminated a scene of unexpected devastation. The passage opened into a small chamber, perhaps 15 feet across, its walls lined with wooden shelving that had once held various objects, but which now lay in ruins across the floor. Whatever had been stored here, and the fragmentary evidence suggested a collection of metal implements, possibly tools or scientific instruments, now scattered in complete disarray, twisted and broken as though subjected to tremendous force. One shelf unit had been completely torn from the wall, its mounting brackets still embedded in the stone like broken teeth, while others hung at precarious angles, threatening to complete their collapse at any moment. Holmes picked his way carefully through this debris, examining items as he went. A bent copper tube here, a shattered glass vessel there, fragments of what might once have been delicate measuring instruments, now rendered into expensive rubbish. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful as he catalogued the destruction. "This was deliberate," he announced, holding up a piece of brass worked into an intricate gear mechanism that had been systematically crushed rather than merely dropped. Someone destroyed these items with considerable force and thoroughness. The question becomes, why? What purpose does such destruction serve? Lord Ashworth remained at the chamber's entrance, unwilling to enter the space of devastation, his face pale in the combined light of lantern and torch. "Those instruments," he said slowly, "they appear to be of considerable age. Elizabethan, perhaps, or even earlier, if these chambers truly were used by John Dee. Then we are standing amid the ruins of his laboratory," Holmes finished, a note of excitement creeping into his voice despite the grim circumstances. "Or one of them, at least. See here, Watson. This vessel bears traces of mercury, and this rod shows evidence of having been subjected to extreme heat. Alchemical apparatus, unless I miss my guess, and of a sophistication that suggests serious scholarly pursuit rather than mere charlatanism." He moved deeper into the chamber, his torch revealing an archway at the far end, beyond which more passages presumably led to other rooms, other secrets buried in these forgotten depths beneath the halls of government. The symbols carved into the walls grew more numerous here, more complex, forming patterns that seemed to flow and connect like some arcane circuit diagram rendered in stone. The air itself felt different in this chamber, heavier somehow, charged with a quality I could not name, but which made the hair on the back of my neck stand at attention. It was as though the very atmosphere remembered what had transpired here centuries ago, remembered and retained some echo of those long ago investigations into the nature of reality and matter, spirit and substance. Holmes stood before the archway now, his torch illuminating the beginning of another passage. This one worked with greater care than those through which we had already travelled. The walls here were smooth, almost polished, and the symbols carved into them were rendered with such precision that they seemed almost to glow in the reflected light, creating an illusion of movement that played tricks on tired eyes. "The trail continues," he said, gesturing into this new darkness, "and I suspect we are drawing closer to the heart of this mystery, to whatever truth lies at the centre of these concentric circles of secrecy and symbol. Shall we proceed?" But before either Lord Ashworth or I could respond, a new sound reached our ears, different from the scraping we had heard earlier, different from the crash of fallen shelving. This was a rhythmic noise, steady and measured, growing gradually louder as it approached from somewhere ahead in the passages that stretched before us. It took me a moment to identify it, and when I did, my blood ran cold. Footsteps. Someone was walking toward us through the darkness, their tread deliberate and unhurried, as though they had all the time in the world and knew exactly where they were going. Those footsteps echoed through stone corridors with the peculiar clarity that underground spaces impart to sound, each impact distinct and separate, marked and separate, marking time with the precision of a metronome. Yet there was something irregular in their rhythm, a slight hesitation between certain steps that suggested either injury or extraordinary caution, as though whoever approached measured each placement with deliberate care. The sound came from the polished passage ahead, from depths we had not yet explored, drawing steadily nearer through darkness that our lights could not penetrate. Holmes extinguished his electric torch with a quick movement, plunging us into the dimmer glow of Lord Ashworth's lantern, and gestured for us to move against the chamber's wall, positioning ourselves where we might observe whoever emerged without being immediately visible ourselves. I kept my revolver ready, but lowered, not wishing to appear aggressive to what might prove a harmless night watchman or maintenance worker, yet prepared to raise it should circumstances demand. The footsteps grew louder still, accompanied now by the soft rustle of fabric and the occasional scrape of a hand trailing along the passage wall for guidance. Then, from the archway through which the polished corridor led, emerged a figure that made all three of us release breaths we had unconsciously held, not from relief, precisely, but from the dispelling of imaginative terrors that darkness and anticipation had conjured in our minds. The man who stepped into the ruined chamber was elderly, perhaps 70 years or more, dressed in the dark uniform of Whitehall's maintenance staff, though his costume bore modifications that spoke of long service and personal preference. A woolen scarf wrapped around his neck against the subterranean chill, a leather satchel slung across one shoulder, and most notably, a miner's lamp affixed to a leather strap around his forehead, its flame casting a small, warm circle of light that moved with his gaze. His face, weathered and creased like old parchment, showed no surprise at finding us there, only a kind of weary resignation, as though he had known we would come eventually and had been waiting for this encounter with patient inevitability. "You'll be the detectives then," he said, without preamble, his voice carrying the rough edges of London's East End beneath a veneer of learned speech, as though education had overlaid but not entirely erased his origins. "Come looking into matters that don't concern the living, I'd wager. Always the way with curious minds. Can't leave well enough alone." Holmes stepped forward into the lantern light, his posture relaxed but alert. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague Dr. Watson. We are indeed investigating certain irregularities at the request of Lord Ashworth, who I believe you recognize." The old man's eyes, sharp and dark despite his evident age, moved to Lord Ashworth, who had stepped partially from the shadows, and something like sympathy crossed his weathered features. I know his lordship, and I know what's been troubling him these past weeks. The letters, the symbols, the feeling that something old and patient has wakened beneath these stones. My name is Cornelius Webb, and I've tended these lower levels for 43 years, since I was a lad of 30, learning the ways of this place from the old keeper who came before me. He moved further into the chamber, his miner's lamp illuminating the devastation of fallen shelving with practiced indifference, as though such disorder was merely part of the natural cycle of these forgotten spaces. From his satchel, he withdrew a small flask and took a measured sip before continuing, his voice dropping to a tone more suited to confidences than confrontations. "These passages," he said, gesturing vaguely at the walls around us, "they go back further than most know, further than the official records account for. When I first came down here, the old keeper, Thomas Greer was his name, God rest him. He showed me rooms that ain't on any map, chambers where the air itself feels thick with memory and purpose. He told me stories his keeper had told him, going back generations, about what was done here in times when knowledge and power were pursued without the constraints of modern propriety." Holmes had produced a small notebook and was recording this information with quick, efficient movements of his pencil. "These chambers where John Dee conducted his investigations, you know of them." Webb nodded slowly, his lamp's flame guttering slightly as air moved through the passages. "I, though calling them investigations is like calling the ocean a puddle. What Dee sought here was nothing less than communion with forces beyond the material world. Angels, he called them, though I've wondered if he knew truly what answered when he called. The rooms he used are deeper still, past 3 more levels, in spaces carved from rock so ancient it remembers when this land was forest and marsh, before Rome, before the tribes, before memory itself." He paused, studying our faces in the uncertain light, seeming to weigh whether we could comprehend what he was attempting to convey. "You've seen the symbols," he continued, "drawn in ash and stranger substances still. They're copies of the originals, you understand. The true seals Dee inscribed are carved into the very stones down below, permanent and powerful as the day they were made. Someone's been using those originals as templates, reproducing them in places designed to unsettle and alarm." Lord Ashworth found his voice at last, though it emerged shakier than I had yet heard it. "You know who has been leaving these letters, who drew the symbol in my bedchamber." The old keeper's expression grew troubled, shadows deepening in the creases of his face. "I have suspicions, your lordship, though voicing them feels like inviting darkness to take form and substance. There are those who believe Dee's work was never truly abandoned, merely driven underground. Scholars and seekers who maintain a kind of secret continuity. passing knowledge from generation to generation like a flame in the dark. They call themselves the Keepers of the Foundation, though whether they keep it safe or keep it active, I've never been entirely certain. A sound from the passage behind Webb made us all start, a soft exhalation of air, as though the tunnels themselves breathed. The old man turned his head, listening with the intensity of one who has learned to interpret the language of stone and silence. Then nodded to himself, as though confirming some private assessment. "The ventilation shafts," he explained, catching our alarmed expressions. "They connect to the surface through chimneys disguised as drainage, allowing air to circulate even in the deepest chambers. Creates odd sounds sometimes, like voices whispering at the edge of hearing. Frightened more than one worker over the years, I can tell you." Holmes moved closer to Webb, his voice taking on that particular quality of urgent inquiry. "These keepers of the Foundation, do they still access these lower levels? Could they have entered the vault, stolen the documents, left the letters? Could they?" Webb's laugh was without humour, a dry sound like autumn leaves stirred by wind. "Mr. Holmes, they never left. Every keeper of these passages has been inducted into their ranks, sworn to protect what lies below, while maintaining the fiction that it's all just storage and forgotten history. I was shown the truth 30 years ago, when old Greer decided I was ready to bear the weight of knowledge. The documents your lordship seeks weren't stolen by an outsider. They were taken by someone who had every right to access them, someone who knew their true significance beyond their surface political value." He reached into his satchel again and withdrew a rolled parchment, yellowed and fragile, which he handed to Holmes with movements suggesting both reverence and relief, as though passing a burden he had carried too long. "This was left for you in one of the deeper chambers. Whoever took the documents knew you would come, Mr. Holmes. They wanted you to follow this trail, wanted you to descend into these depths and confront truths that surface-dwelling minds prefer to ignore." Holmes unrolled the parchment carefully, angling it towards the combined light of lantern and miner's lamp. The document bore writing in that same archaic hand we had seen on the letters, but this message was longer, more detailed, covering the entire page in dense script interspersed with diagrams and symbols. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave, the excitement of investigation giving way to something deeper and more somber. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge I rarely heard, uncertainty wrestling with fascination, the tension between what reason suggested and what evidence implied. "This purports to be a confession," he said slowly, "written by someone claiming to be the last direct descendant of one of Dee's assistants, a scholar named Nathaniel Crowhurst, who helped establish what became the modern Home Office's predecessor institutions. The writer claims that certain founding documents of British governance were created not merely through political negotiation, but through methods Dee believed would bind supernatural forces to the protection of the realm, ritual magic, if such terms can be applied to what was essentially an elaborate blending of mathematics, linguistics, and psychological manipulation. Lord Ashworth had gone even paler, if such were possible. "You cannot mean to suggest—" "I suggest nothing," Holmes interrupted firmly. "I merely report what this document claims. Whether the writer believes these claims or uses them as elaborate misdirection remains to be determined. However, the document goes on to state that the missing papers detail these original arrangements, and that they were removed not to threaten Britain, but to preserve the realm from what the writer calls the awakening consequence of promises made without understanding their true cost. Webb nodded, as though this confirmed his own understanding. The demon of Whitehall isn't a supernatural entity, Mr. Holmes. It's a metaphor for obligations incurred by those who built these institutions upon foundations of knowledge they didn't fully comprehend. Every structure casts a shadow, and the grander the structure, the deeper that shadow extends. What's happening now is simply the past asserting itself, demanding recognition and perhaps renegotiation of terms set centuries ago by men who never imagined the world we now inhabit. The chamber had grown colder during this exchange, or perhaps the chill I felt was entirely internal, a response to ideas that challenged comfortable assumptions about history and power, rationality and belief. Holmes stood silent for a long moment, the parchment still held in his hands, his brilliant mind no doubt racing through implications and possibilities, seeking solid ground amid shifting sands of interpretation. Finally, he rolled the parchment carefully and secured it in an inner pocket of his coat. Mr. Webb, I must ask you to guide us to these deeper chambers you mentioned. If the truth of this matter lies anywhere, it will be found in the places where Dee conducted his work, where these supposed foundations were laid. Lord Ashworth, you need not accompany us if you prefer to return to the surface. What we may discover below might prove unsettling. But our client straightened his shoulders, some inner resolve hardening his features, despite obvious fear. No, Mr. Holmes. I have lived with mystery and dread for weeks now. Whatever lies ahead, I would rather confront it directly than continue to suffer the torment of imagination unanchored by fact. Lead on, Mr. Webb. Let us descend to the very bottom of this mystery and see what truths or terrors await us there. Webb studied each of us in turn, his ancient eyes seeming to measure something beyond mere determination. Perhaps the resilience of our minds, our capacity to absorb revelation without breaking. Whatever he saw apparently satisfied him, for he nodded once and turned toward the polished passage from which he had emerged. Very well then, gentlemen, follow close and watch your footing. The path grows steeper from here, and there are places where the rock itself seems reluctant to bear the weight of those who walk upon it. We go down now into the true depths, into chambers that have not seen sunlight since they were sealed 400 years ago, into the very heart of what supports and what haunts these halls of power. He set off into the darkness, his miner's lamp casting its small circle of illumination ahead, and we followed, drawn by curiosity and duty and that peculiar human compulsion to pursue knowledge even when wisdom might suggest retreat. The passage descended sharply now, carved stairs appearing beneath our feet, worn smooth by centuries of use, yet somehow still bearing the marks of the tools that had first shaped them. The walls pressed closer, the ceiling lower, and the air grew thick with scents of earth and time, of sealed spaces holding their breath against intrusion. Down we went, and down further still, leaving behind the ruins of Dee's laboratory, leaving behind the comfortable fictions of documented history, descending toward origins and foundations, toward secrets that had been buried not just in stone, but in the very structure of the state itself, hidden beneath layers of protocol and propriety, waiting patient and eternal for someone curious enough or foolish enough to seek them out in their ancient darkness. Recalling Sherlock Holmes' Gothic mystery narrative progression. Tense LC Gothic elements. The stairway, carved into living rock, descended in a spiral so gradual that one might not immediately perceive the depth to which it led. Yet, with each complete revolution, we passed markers that suggested the antiquity of our journey. First carved Roman numerals at intervals along the wall, then older symbols that predated Latin script, and finally simple notched tallies cut deep into stone by hands that had worked before written language had come to these islands. Webb's miner's lamp threw dancing shadows against these ancient marks, transforming them momentarily into something almost alive before the darkness reclaimed them behind us. The quality of silence changed as we descended, becoming not merely the absence of sound, but rather a presence unto itself, a thickness in the air that seemed to muffle even our breathing. I found my chest tightening slightly, whether from the close atmosphere or from some psychological response to our depth beneath the surface world, and I consciously slowed my breathing, forcing calm into lungs that wanted to quicken their pace. Lord Ashworth walked immediately ahead of me, one hand trailing along the wall for balance, and I could see tension in the set of his shoulders, the careful placement of each foot as though he walked across ice of uncertain thickness. Holmes followed directly behind Webb, and even in the dim and uncertain light, I could observe the intensity of his focus, his head turning to examine each carved symbol we passed, his keen mind no doubt cataloguing and comparing, seeking patterns within the apparent randomness of these ancient marks. Once, he paused to run his fingers across a particularly deep carving, something that resembled a wheel or circular maze, and I saw his lips move silently, as though counting the pattern's elements or reciting some private mnemonic. "How much further?" Lord Ashworth asked, his voice emerging thin and strained in the oppressive quiet. The question echoed strangely, repeating itself in whispers that seemed to come from passages we had not taken, from spaces adjacent to, but not quite connected with our descending path. "Not far now," Webb replied, though distance and time had grown so distorted in this lightless realm that such assurances felt meaningless. "The deepest chambers lie just beyond the next landing, through a door that has remained sealed since the last of Dee's direct successors departed these spaces. I hold the only key in existence, passed down through the keepers, and I have used it but 3 times in 43 years, each time to show another what lies below, to ensure the knowledge is not lost entirely should I fail to find a worthy successor before my time runs out." The stairway opened suddenly into a small antechamber, its walls bearing no ornamentation, save for a single carved inscription above a heavy door of dark wood bound with iron that had oxidized to a deep rust brown over the centuries. Webb raised his lamp to illuminate the inscription, revealing words in Latin that Holmes immediately translated, his voice soft with something approaching reverence. "Here lies the foundation upon which all else is built. Let those who enter remember that every structure requires support, and every support requires sacrifice. What was given cannot be taken back, only honoured or abandoned." He paused, considering the words. Not precisely welcoming, but philosophically intriguing. The Romans understood that every civilization rests upon previous work, previous decisions, previous compromises with necessity. Webb had withdrawn a key from around his neck. Not the brass affair Lord Ashworth had used above, but rather something older, fashioned from iron and worn smooth by generations of handling. He fitted it into a lock that was itself a work of art, decorated with symbols and mechanisms, visible even from several feet away. suggesting a security both physical and psychological. The lock turned with surprising smoothness despite its age, and the door swung inward with barely a whisper of sound, revealing a chamber beyond that made all of us pause at the threshold, caught between fascination and an instinctive reluctance to proceed further into spaces so thoroughly removed from the world of daylight and common sense. The room that Webb's lamp illuminated was vast, far larger than seemed possible at this depth, extending perhaps 50 feet in each direction, with a ceiling that rose to form a shallow dome, perhaps 20 feet overhead. But it was not the dimensions that captured our attention. It was the contents. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelves, and those shelves held volumes beyond counting. Books bound in leather and wood, and stranger materials still, their spines bearing titles in languages I recognized, and others I did not. Some rendered in gilt lettering that caught the lamplight, and others in inks that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. At the chamber's center stood a large table of dark wood, its surface scarred with centuries of use, yet still solid and functional, bearing upon it an array of instruments and apparatus that would have looked at home in both a natural philosopher's laboratory and an alchemist's workshop. Glass vessels of complex design, metal instruments calibrated for measurements I could not fathom, charts and diagrams spread across available space showing astronomical calculations, geometric proofs, and symbolic systems that combined elements from multiple traditions into something entirely unique. Dee's sanctum, Holmes breathed, stepping fully into the room with movements that suggested he had forgotten caution in the face of such a discovery. Watson, do you comprehend what we are seeing? This is not merely a historical curiosity. This is a complete working environment, preserved exactly as it was used, a snapshot of Renaissance intellectual pursuit, frozen in time and darkness. He moved to the table, his hands hovering over the instruments without quite touching them, drinking in details with that remarkable visual memory that allowed him to retain entire scenes for later analysis. Webb had moved to light several lanterns that hung from wall brackets, and as additional illumination filled the chamber, new wonders revealed themselves. Star charts painted directly onto the domed ceiling, their constellations rendered with such precision that they must have been copied from actual observation. Shelves holding not merely books, but also specimens preserved in fluid, minerals arranged by some organizing principle, and what appeared to be mathematical models constructed from wood and metal to demonstrate principles of geometry and proportion. Lord Ashworth had remained near the doorway, his earlier resolve apparently tested by the reality of this place, by the palpable sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from every surface. "This is impossible," he murmured. "Such a space beneath Whitehall, unknown and unrecorded. How could successive governments have simply forgotten about it?" "Not forgotten," Webb corrected, lighting the last of the lanterns. "Hidden, deliberately obscured through careful management of architectural records, through the destruction of certain documents and the alteration of others. The official line has always been that Dee's chambers were cleared and filled in after his death. But the truth, as you now see, is rather different. The work continued long after Dee himself had passed, maintained by those who understood its value, even if they didn't fully comprehend its methods or its goals. Holmes had moved to examine the books, running his finger along their spines with the delicate touch of one who recognizes the fragility of ancient bindings. "Here is Dee's own Monus Hieroglyphica," he announced, carefully removing a slim volume and opening it with reverence. And beside it, manuscripts I do not recognize. Probably working notes never intended for publication. These alone would be worth a fortune to collectors, yet they sit here gathering dust, their knowledge accessible to none, save those few who know of this chamber's existence. A sound from somewhere in the chamber made us all start, the soft rustle of pages turning, though none of us stood near any book that might have moved. Holmes's head snapped toward the source, his body tensing, but after a moment he relaxed, a slight smile crossing his features. "Air currents," he explained, gesturing toward a series of small openings near the ceiling. Webb mentioned ventilation shafts. The flow of air through this space would be sufficient to disturb loose pages. Nothing supernatural, merely physics. Yet even as he spoke, I felt less certain than his words suggested. There was something about this chamber that resisted simple material explanation, some quality in the air itself that made the skin prickle, and the mind conjure shadows at the periphery of vision. Perhaps it was merely the psychological effect of depth and isolation, the knowledge that we stood in a space cut off from sun and sky, from the ordinary human world where reason governed and mysteries yielded to investigation. Or perhaps, and this thought troubled me more than I cared to admit, perhaps some spaces simply accumulated meaning over time, soaking it up like sponges absorb water, until they became saturated with purpose and intention that persisted long after their creators had departed. Webb had moved to a section of wall that appeared at first to be merely another bookshelf, but which, upon closer examination, revealed itself to be a kind of cabinet with dozens of small drawers, each labelled in neat script. He opened several in sequence, revealing contents that ranged from mundane, dried herbs, mineral samples, to perplexing, small vials of liquid that seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, fragments of mirror arranged in patterns, and what appeared to be human hair, bound with red thread. "These materia," he explained, seeing our interest. "Components for his various experiments and operations. Some are merely chemical reagents. Others had significance primarily symbolic or psychological. The man was brilliant, but also very much a product of his time. He saw no contradiction between rigorous mathematics and what we would now dismiss as superstition. To him, it was all natural philosophy, all part of a unified investigation into the structure of reality." Holmes had found something on the central table that drew his complete attention, a large leather-bound ledger that lay open to pages covered in dense notation. He bent close, his lamp casting light across what appeared to be a kind of account book or experimental log, recording dates, procedures, observations, and conclusions in Dee's own hand, if the signature at several entries was any indication. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, turning pages with exquisite care. Dee recorded everything, not just the procedures themselves, but also atmospheric conditions, lunar phases, even his own mental and physical state before beginning each operation. The man was conducting research with a rigor that would satisfy any modern scientist, though his hypotheses and methods were drawn from traditions we no longer credit. He fell silent, reading intently, and the rest of us waited in that strange chamber, while Holmes absorbed whatever secrets the ledger contained. Minutes passed, marked only by the soft hiss of lantern flames and the occasional distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the vast network of passages and chambers that honeycomb the earth beneath London's streets. Finally, Holmes looked up, his expression troubled in a way I had rarely seen. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, "I believe I have found the key to understanding both the missing documents and the messages Lord Ashworth has been receiving. If this ledger is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt Dee's meticulous record-keeping, then certain procedures were conducted in this very chamber in the autumn of 1583. Procedures designed to, in Dee's words, bind the fortunes of this realm to principles beyond the corruptions of mortal governance." Lord Ashworth stepped forward despite his evident unease. Meaning what, precisely? Meaning that Dee believed he was establishing supernatural protections for England, protections that would persist so long as certain conditions were maintained. "The documents you mentioned, the ones detailing agreements between the Crown and foreign powers, I suspect they include clauses or provisions that unknowingly violate these conditions, and some member of this secret society Webb mentioned, removed those documents to prevent what they believe would be catastrophic consequences of breaking Dee's original compact." The chamber seemed to grow colder as Holmes spoke, and I found myself moving closer to the nearest lantern, seeking its warmth against a chill that might have been entirely psychological, but felt no less real for that possibility. Webb nodded slowly, his ancient face grave in the shifting light. "The keepers have long maintained that certain principles must be upheld," he confirmed, "not from superstition, but from a kind of conservative caution, the sense that we tamper with foundations at our peril, even if we no longer remember precisely why those foundations were laid as they were. If the modern government has indeed negotiated agreements that contradict Dee's original framework." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air like smoke from the lanterns. Holmes had returned to the ledger, flipping pages forward to entries dated weeks and months after the initial procedures, tracking Dee's observations of their supposed effects. His finger stopped on a particular passage, and when he read it aloud, his voice carried a weight that suggested he found the words significant beyond their surface meaning. "The foundation is laid and cannot be unlaid," he recited. "What has been bound will remain bound until the conditions of dissolution are met, and those conditions I have hidden where they cannot be found by those who lack understanding. Let future generations maintain what I have built, or let them face the consequences of its abandonment. The choice is theirs, but the price is fixed and immutable." Outside the chamber, somewhere in the dark passages that led back toward the surface, a sound echoed, distant but distinct, the boom of a heavy door closing, followed by the unmistakable click of a lock being turned. The sound of that distant lock engaging seemed to crystallize the air around us, transforming our archaeological curiosity into something far more immediate and pressing. We stood frozen in Dee's sanctum, 4 men suddenly aware that our investigation had shifted from academic to perilous, that whoever had orchestrated this elaborate trail of clues had anticipated our arrival, and now moved to control the terms of our encounter with whatever truths lay buried in these depths. Holmes recovered first, as he invariably did when circumstances demanded swift assessment and action. He closed the ledger with careful deliberation, as though refusing to allow urgency to override proper respect for historical artifacts, then turned to Webb with a question delivered in tones of perfect calm That sound came from which direction? And more importantly, which door has been sealed? Our entrance to this level, or something deeper still? The old keeper tilted his head, listening to echoes that had already faded into the pervasive silence, his decades of experience in these passages allowing him to interpret acoustic signatures that meant nothing to our less practiced ears. "The main access," he said finally, his voice carrying grim certainty. "The door at the top of the spiral stair, the one we descended to reach this antechamber. Someone has locked it from the other side, which means..." He paused, the implications organizing themselves visibly across his weathered features. "Which means they want us to remain here, to continue deeper rather than retreat. There are other passages leading from this sanctum, routes that connect to different sections of the underground network, but they are less direct and considerably more hazardous." Lord Ashworth had gone quite pale again, the brief courage he had mustered now tested by the concrete reality of entrapment. "We are sealed in, trapped in these chambers with no immediate means of escape." "Trapped is perhaps too strong a word," Holmes interjected, though I detected beneath his measured tone a current of excitement that suggested he found this development more intriguing than alarming. "Guided would be more accurate. Someone wishes to ensure we follow a particular path, encounter specific revelations in a predetermined sequence. This entire affair has been choreographed from the beginning. The letters designed to disturb Lord Ashworth sufficiently that he would seek my assistance. The symbols placed where they would lead us to question the nature of Whitehall's foundations. And now this theatrical sealing of doors to ensure we proceed toward whatever climax our mysterious playwright has arranged." He began to pace the perimeter of Dee's chamber, his movements fluid despite the confined space cluttered with centuries of accumulated apparatus and documentation. The lantern light caught his profile as he moved, throwing his shadow large against walls lined with forbidden knowledge, and I was reminded forcefully of how perfectly suited he was to such moments, how his entire being seemed to sharpen and focus when presented with puzzles that would reduce lesser minds to confusion or panic. "Webb," he said, stopping before a section of bookshelf that appeared identical to all the others, yet had captured his particular attention. "You mentioned other passages leading from this sanctum. Show me where they begin, and tell me what you know of where they lead." The keeper moved to join Holmes, reaching up to pull on what appeared to be merely a decorative wooden finial atop one of the shelf supports. The entire section swung outward with a soft click of released mechanisms, revealing a narrow opening through which cold air flowed, carrying scents of mineral deposits and underground water. Beyond this threshold, stone steps descended at a steep angle, carved more roughly than those we had previously traversed, suggesting greater age or perhaps less official sanction. "This passage," Webb explained, his miner's lamp held toward the opening, "leads to the oldest sections, pre-Roman foundations, possibly even earlier. When I first explored them as a young man, I found evidence of habitation going back to when this area was marsh and sacred grove, when the river ran different courses and the land remembered older names than London. There are chambers down there that were never part of Dee's work, spaces he discovered and incorporated but did not create. Whether he understood what he had found, I cannot say, but his notes suggest he treated certain areas with particular reverence or caution." Holmes peered into the revealed passage, his analytical mind clearly weighing options and probabilities. And this route, does it eventually connect back to the surface, or does it merely lead deeper into the earth? Both, Webb replied. There are connections to the Thames tunnel system, to old Roman sewers that still function beneath the modern ones, even to crypts beneath churches, whose congregations long ago forgot the full extent of their foundations. With knowledge and determination, one could navigate from here to a dozen different exits across this part of London. Without such knowledge, he shrugged eloquently, one might wander for days, or fall into pits where the ground has collapsed, or find oneself in chambers that flood with tidal flow. A sound from elsewhere in Dee's sanctum made us all turn. The soft scrape of wood against stone, subtle but definite. Holmes moved toward it with quick strides, his hand instinctively reaching for the electric torch in his pocket. The sound had come from near the great table where the ledger lay, and as we approached, we could see that one of the table's drawers, a deep compartment I had not previously noticed, had slid partially open, as though whatever mechanism held it closed had suddenly released. Holmes pulled the drawer fully open, revealing contents that made even his practiced composure falter momentarily. Inside lay a single object, a mask crafted from dark metal, possibly bronze or copper, gone black with age, worked into a design that combined human features with geometric patterns, similar to those we had seen in the mysterious symbols. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the face neither male nor female, but rather archetypal, expressing an emotion somewhere between sorrow and stern purpose. Eye holes had been cut to allow vision, and the interior was lined with leather smoothed by long use. Beside the mask lay a folded garment of heavy black fabric, and a sealed envelope of modern manufacture that stood out starkly against the ancient materials surrounding it. Holmes reached for the envelope first, noting as he did so that it bore his name written in that same archaic script we had seen on the letters to Lord Ashworth. He broke the seal, red wax impressed with a symbol we now recognized, and withdrew several sheets of paper covered in dense handwriting. As he read, I watched emotions play across his features in rapid succession. Interest, surprise, calculation, and finally, something approaching reluctant admiration. "This," he said at length, looking up to meet our expectant gazes, "is both confession and invitation. The writer identifies himself as Sir Edmund Blackwood, one of the 3 officials with access to the vault where the documents were kept. He admits to taking them, admits to leaving the letters and symbols, admits to engineering this entire elaborate sequence of events to bring us to this precise moment." Lord Ashworth gasped audibly. "Edmund, but that is impossible. I have known him for 20 years. He is the most conventional, the most by-the-book official in the entire ministry. The idea that he would involve himself in secret societies and occult machinations is utterly absurd." "And yet," Holmes countered gently, "that very conventionality would make him the perfect guardian of unconventional secrets, would it not? Who would suspect the most bureaucratic and orthodox official of harbouring beliefs and knowledge that run counter to everything his public persona suggests?" He returned his attention to the letter, reading selected passages aloud for our benefit. "Mr. Holmes, if you are reading this, you have proven yourself worthy of the truth I am prepared to share. For 15 years, I have served as one of the keepers of the Foundation, maintaining vigilance over principles established centuries ago by minds that understood connections between governance and cosmic order that our modern materialist age has forgotten or dismissed. The documents I removed contain clauses that would, if enacted, violate fundamental conditions upon which Britain's stability has rested since the Elizabethan era. I could not allow such violations to proceed, yet I also could not simply destroy the documents without invitation of scrutiny that would expose truths the keepers have protected for generations. Therefore, I have chosen to invite investigation, to draw into these depths someone whose mind is capable of comprehending what I must reveal without dismissing it as mere superstition or madness. Holmes paused, his eyes scanning ahead in the letter, before continuing. The mask and robe in the drawer were worn by John Dee himself during certain crucial procedures. I ask that you don them and proceed through the passage that has been revealed to you. Descend to the chamber that lies at the very foundation of this place, where I await with the missing documents and with evidence that will demonstrate beyond doubt the reality of what I have claimed. Come alone, Mr. Holmes, or with such companions as you trust to maintain discretion regarding what they witness. The door above has been sealed not to trap you, but to ensure our meeting occurs without interruption from those who would prevent certain truths from being acknowledged. He set down the letter and stood in contemplative silence, one hand absently stroking his chin in that characteristic gesture that indicated deep consideration of multiple variables and possibilities. The chamber around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision, and even the lantern flames burned with unusual stillness, as though the air itself had frozen in anticipation. "This is clearly a trap of some kind," Lord Ashworth said, his voice carrying more hope than conviction, as though he wished someone would confirm this assessment and provide justification for retreat. "Possibly," Holmes acknowledged, "though I suspect Blackwood's intentions are more complex than simple entrapment would suggest. He has gone to extraordinary lengths to orchestrate this encounter, to provide just enough information to intrigue without fully explaining, to lead us through revelations designed to overcome skepticism incrementally rather than demanding immediate acceptance of extraordinary claims." He lifted the mask, turning it in the light, examining its construction with the eye of one who appreciates fine workmanship regardless of the object's purpose. The question is not whether this is theatre. Clearly it is. The question is whether the performance serves truth or deception. Whether Blackwood genuinely believes in what he protects, or merely uses these trappings to obscure more mundane motivations. I moved closer to examine the mask myself, feeling an odd reluctance to touch it, despite my rational dismissal of any supernatural properties it might be claimed to possess. The metal was cool under my fingertips, worked with such skill that it seemed almost alive. The geometric patterns carved into its surface, creating optical effects that made the features appear to shift subtly, depending on the angle of observation. "Holmes," I said quietly, "if you intend to accept this invitation, and I can see that you do, then I am coming with you. Whatever waits in those deeper chambers, you should not face it alone." He turned to me with an expression of genuine warmth, the kind of unguarded affection he rarely displayed, but which I knew represented the depth of our friendship more accurately than any words could convey. "I would expect nothing less, Watson. Your presence has proven invaluable in circumstances far stranger than this, and I confess I would feel diminished proceeding without you." Webb had been listening to this exchange, with an expression that mingled respect with concern. "If you, gentlemen, are determined to descend further, I should accompany you. I know these passages better than any living soul, and there are hazards beyond mere navigation. Unstable floors, sudden drops, sections that flood without warning. And there is always the possibility that Blackwood's invitation is not as benevolent as his letter suggests. Then we four shall make this descent together," Holmes declared, picking up the black robe and examining it with practical assessment. Though I confess the theatrical elements, the mask, the ritual garment, strike me as unnecessary embellishments. Still, if Blackwood wishes to stage this encounter with such props, I see no harm in obliging him. Psychology plays as great a role as evidence in many investigations, and if wearing Dee's ceremonial mask creates an atmosphere that encourages revelations, then I shall don it with the same pragmatic spirit with which I might wear a disguise while investigating in the docklands. He slipped the robe over his clothing, and I was struck by how the simple act of putting on this costume seemed to transform him, lending his already dramatic bearing an additional quality of mystery and purpose. When he lifted the mask to his face and secured its leather straps, the effect was genuinely unsettling. The geometric patterns seemed to writhe in the lamplight, and his eyes, visible through the cut apertures, gleamed with an intensity that might have been entirely his own, or might have been somehow enhanced by the mask's strange properties. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice slightly muffled, but still perfectly clear, "let us proceed to the foundation of this mystery and see what truths or revelations await us in the deepest darkness beneath Whitehall." Webb led the way into the revealed passage, his miner's lamp bobbing ahead like a will-o'-the-wisp, leading travellers into uncertain territory. Holmes followed, the black robe swirling around his tall frame, and I came after, with Lord Ashworth bringing up the rear, his lantern casting our combined shadows, huge and distorted, against the rough stone walls. Down we went, into older earth, into spaces that predated human memory, descending toward whatever climax Sir Edmund Blackwood had so carefully arranged, toward truths that would either illuminate or further obscure the mystery of the demon of Whitehall. The stone beneath our feet grew progressively older as we descended. It descended, its character transforming from the worked surfaces of human construction to something more primal and organic, as though we travelled backward through geological epochs toward bedrock that had never known the touch of chisel or hammer. The walls pressed closer here, their surfaces slick with moisture that seeped from invisible sources, and the air itself seemed to thicken, carrying minerals and earth scents that spoke of depths no sunlight had ever penetrated. Our combined lights, Webb's miner's lamp, Lord Ashworth's lantern, Holmes's electric torch, glimpsing occasionally through the eye-holes of Dee's mask, created shifting pools of illumination that revealed the passage in fragments, never allowing us to see more than a few feet ahead or behind, isolating us in a moving bubble of visibility, surrounded by absolute darkness. The temperature had dropped significantly, enough that our breath showed faintly in the lamplight, pale wisps that hung briefly in the still air before dissipating. I found myself drawing my coat tighter, though the chill seemed to penetrate beyond mere physical cold, settling into bones and thoughts with a quality that suggested this depth existed somehow outside the normal parameters of temperature and comfort. Lord Ashworth moved with increasing hesitation, his earlier resolve tested by the relentless descent into earth and time, and I positioned myself closer to him, offering silent companionship against the oppressive atmosphere of these ancient passages. Holmes moved with undiminished purpose, the black robe flowing behind him like smoke-given substance, the mask upon his face transforming his already distinctive silhouette into something that belonged more to myth than to the Victorian age of reason and progress. I could not see his expression, hidden as it was behind that enigmatic bronze facade, but I knew him well enough to sense the intensity of his focus, the way his entire being had oriented itself toward the revelation that awaited us in whatever chamber Sir Edmund Blackwood had chosen for this carefully orchestrated encounter. Webb paused suddenly, raising one hand in a gesture that halted our small procession. "Ahead," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying clearly in the confined space. The passage opens into the foundation chamber, the lowest point of this entire complex, built upon rock so ancient it was old when the first humans walked these islands. What you see there, what you experience, I cannot predict. Each person who enters perceives it differently, as though the space itself reflects something unique from every observer. Keep your wits about you, gentlemen, and remember that whatever seems supernatural is merely natural processes we have not yet learned to measure or explain. He resumed walking, and within a dozen steps, the narrow passage indeed widened, the ceiling rising and the walls falling away, until we emerged into a space so vast that our lights could not immediately define its boundaries. The chamber revealed itself incrementally as we moved forward. First, a floor of smooth stone, not cut or shaped, but naturally level, as though the earth itself had provided a platform. Then walls that curved upward in a dome shape, their surfaces covered entirely in carved symbols and text in languages that ranged from recognizable Latin to scripts I had never encountered. And finally, at the chamber's center, a circular platform raised perhaps a foot above the surrounding floor, its perimeter marked by standing stones that might have been placed by druids or by civilizations even more ancient. Upon this platform stood a figure in a black robe identical to the one Holmes wore, his face similarly masked, though his mask differed in subtle details from Dee's, the features sharper, the geometric patterns more angular, creating an impression of severity where Dee's mask suggested contemplation. This could only be Sir Edmund Blackwood, though transformed by costume and context into something simultaneously more and less than the government official Lord Ashworth had described. On the platform before him, arranged with precise care, lay a series of documents, the missing papers, I presumed, their edges weighted down by smooth river stones to prevent them from being disturbed, by the slight air currents that moved through this cavernous space. Beside the documents rested what appeared to be a ceremonial dagger, its blade dark with age, and several items I could not immediately identify, perhaps components for some ritual Blackwood intended to perform, or merely props in this elaborate theatre he had created. "Mr. Holmes," Blackwood's voice emerged from behind his mask, cultured and measured, despite the bizarre circumstances. "Dr. Watson, Lord Ashworth, and faithful Webb, welcome to the Foundation Chamber, to the place where all of Whitehall's power ultimately rests, whether those who work in the offices above realize it or not." He gestured around the vast space, with movements that suggested long practice in such theatrical gestures. "What you see here predates British governance, predates Roman occupation, predates written history in these islands. This was a sacred space when the river gods still received offerings, and the land itself was worshipped as a living entity. Holmes moved closer to the platform, his masked face tilted as he examined the arrangement of documents and ritual objects with that penetrating observation he brought to every investigation. "Sir Edmund," he said, his voice carrying an odd resonance filtered through the bronze mask. "Your letter promised demonstration and evidence. I am prepared to observe and evaluate. But I must ask, why this elaborate staging? If you merely wish to explain your actions regarding the documents, a meeting in some quiet office would have sufficed. Why lead us through these depths? Why require masks and robes? Why transform a simple explanation into this occult pageantry?" Blackwood's masked face turned toward Holmes, and though I could not see his eyes, I sensed amusement in his bearing. "Because, Mr. Holmes, some truths cannot be conveyed through mere words in ordinary settings. The mind resists what contradicts its fundamental assumptions about reality, unless that resistance is overcome through experience rather than argument. What I must show you requires this setting, requires the weight of centuries and symbols, requires you to stand in a place where the boundary between material and immaterial has always been more permeable than in the sunlit world above." He bent and lifted one of the documents, holding it toward Holmes. "This treaty, negotiated in secret between Her Majesty's government and the German Empire, contains clauses that would establish commercial relationships violating principles laid down by John Dee during the establishment of Britain's imperial framework. I do not speak metaphorically or symbolically. Dee literally inscribed certain conditions into the foundational documents of Elizabethan governance, conditions that subsequent generations have unknowingly maintained. Because they were woven so deeply into institutional practice that they became invisible assumptions rather than explicit rules." Holmes took the offered document, angling it toward the light to read its contents. His posture remained neutral, giving nothing away, but I knew he was absorbing every word, every implication, processing the information with that remarkable analytical engine that was his mind. A sudden sound interrupted the tableau, the sharp crack of stone breaking somewhere in the darkness beyond our lights. We all tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons or toward each other for mutual reassurance. But the sound was not repeated, leaving only echoes that seemed to circle the chamber like restless spirits before fading into silence. "The foundations settling," Webb observed, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "This deep, the rock shifts constantly under the weight of the city above. Sometimes pieces break free and fall into the voids between chambers." Blackwood nodded acknowledgement of this explanation, but continued his discourse without visible concern for the disturbance. "Mr. Holmes, I have brought you here because the keepers of the Foundation face a crisis. The modern government, in its ignorance of what supports it, prepares to enact policies that will, if our understanding is correct, dissolve protections that have shielded Britain from certain catastrophic possibilities for over 300 years. We cannot prove this in the scientific sense you would prefer, cannot demonstrate cause and effect with experimental rigor, but we have centuries of observational data suggesting that when Dee's conditions are violated, consequences follow with disturbing reliability." He gestured to the carved walls around us, and as I looked more carefully at those ancient inscriptions, I began to perceive that they were not random symbols, but rather organized chronologically, creating a kind of timeline rendered in stone. These records, Blackwood continued, document what the keepers have observed across generations. Every time a government has moved to enact policies contrary to the foundation principles, either those policies have failed through seemingly random circumstances, or the officials proposing them have encountered obstacles that appear coincidental, but which, viewed in aggregate, suggest pattern rather than chance. Holmes had finished reading the treaty and now stood in contemplative silence, the documents held loosely in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that particular quality of a mind working through implications that challenged its fundamental framework. What you describe could be explained through psychological and social mechanisms rather than supernatural intervention. Officials who unconsciously absorbed institutional culture would naturally resist innovations that violated that culture's deepest assumptions. The appearance of protection could be merely the conservative inertia of large bureaucracies. I anticipated that response, Blackwood replied, reaching for another document from the platform, which is why I have compiled specific examples that strain purely materialist explanation. The Chancellor, who proposed dismantling certain naval protocols in 1847, protocols that unknowingly maintained one of D's conditions, died of a heart attack the night before the vote. The committee that recommended changes to commercial law in 1890, changes that would have violated another condition, saw 3 of its 5 members simultaneously struck with an illness that rendered them unable to attend the crucial session. The pattern repeats across centuries, Mr. Holmes, with a statistical improbability that becomes harder to dismiss as mere coincidence. Lord Ashworth, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing agitation, finally found his voice. Edmund, this is madness. You speak of supernatural protections and mystical conditions as though they were established fact rather than the delusions of an earlier, less enlightened age. John Dee was a brilliant man, yes, but also a product of his time, a time when science and superstition had not yet been fully separated. Whatever rituals he performed here were based on misunderstandings of causation and natural law. He moved to the edge of the platform, his robed figure seeming to merge with the shadows that pressed close beyond our circle of light. The question before us now is not whether you believe what I have told you. Belief or disbelief changes nothing about the reality we face. The question is whether you will help prevent what the keepers fear will be catastrophic consequences if the current government proceeds with its planned reforms. I have removed the documents to create delay, to buy time for wiser counsel to prevail. But I cannot maintain this fiction much longer, without exposure and ruin. Holmes had been examining the other documents on the platform, his masked face turning from one to another, absorbing information with that speed-reading capability he possessed. Finally, he straightened, his tall form imposing in the ceremonial robe. And when he spoke, his words carried the weight of considered judgment rather than hasty dismissal. Sir Edmund, I cannot claim to accept your interpretation of these patterns and protections. My rational mind rebels against assigning causation to mystical principles, when psychological and social mechanisms might suffice as explanation. However, he paused, and I heard in that pause the sound of a great mind acknowledging the limitations of its own certainty. However, I also cannot definitively prove the negative, cannot demonstrate beyond all doubt that no such protections exist. And there is a principle of prudent risk management that suggests when the potential consequences of being wrong are catastrophic, one should err toward caution, even in the face of uncertain evidence. Blackwood's masked head tilted, suggesting interest. "You propose—" "I propose that we find a middle path," Holmes replied. "Return the documents, but with recommendations for modifications to the proposed treaties. Modifications that preserve your foundation principles, while still allowing the government to pursue its diplomatic and commercial objectives. If you truly believe these principles are embedded in institutional practice, then frame them in modern language as procedural best practices or strategic guidelines. Remove the mystical overlay, retain the practical substance." The silence that followed this suggestion seemed to stretch, filling the vast chamber with weight and possibility. Then Blackwood reached up and removed his mask, revealing features I could now see belonged indeed to a man Lord Ashworth would recognize. Distinguished, late middle age, with eyes that carried the burden of knowledge he could not fully share with those around him in his ordinary life. "That," he said softly, "is perhaps the wisest counsel I have heard in 15 years of wrestling with this responsibility. The keepers have been so focused on protecting the literal truth, as we understand it, that we failed to consider adaptive preservation, maintaining the essence while allowing the form to evolve." He gathered the documents carefully, his movements suggesting both relief and residual concern. "But Mr. Holmes, I must ask, will you help me frame these recommendations? Your reputation and analytical abilities would lend credibility that my own advocacy, once my role in this affair becomes known, will have lost." Holmes removed his own mask, and I saw his familiar features resume their natural animation, no longer hidden behind bronze and geometric mystery. "I will help," he confirmed, "though I make no promises about the outcome. Government policy is shaped by forces beyond any one individual's influence, mystical protections or no. But if your principles have merit, and some of them, I confess, strike me as sound strategic doctrine, regardless of their supposed supernatural origins, then they deserve consideration on their own terms." A sound from above made us all look upward, the distant but definite noise of the sealed door being opened, followed by voices calling down through the passages. Searching voices that grew gradually louder as their sources approached. Through the maze of underground chambers, those descending voices carried with them the mundane concerns of the surface world, authority and protocol, alarm and investigation, cutting through the timeless atman, cutting through the timeless atmosphere of the foundation chamber like daylight piercing ancient darkness. Holmes and Blackwood exchanged a glance of mutual understanding. Two men who had reached accord in this strange theatre of masks and symbols, now facing the practical consequences of their subterranean conference. Webb moved quickly to extinguish some of the lanterns, reducing our illumination to levels less theatrical, while Lord Ashworth stood frozen between relief at potential rescue and apprehension about explaining our presence in chambers that officially did not exist. The voices resolved into words as their sources drew nearer. I recognized the clipped tones of authority, perhaps security officials or senior government personnel, alerted to Lord Ashworth's extended absence and concerned about breach of protocol. Holmes acted with characteristic decisiveness, gathering the documents from the platform and pressing them into Blackwood's hands with quiet urgency. "Take these back to the vault. he instructed, his voice low but clear. Webb can guide you through the alternate passages, while Watson and I delay whoever approaches with explanations that satisfy without revealing what need not be revealed. Lord Ashworth will corroborate our story, that we were investigating the theft and following leads that brought us into these lower levels. The masks, the robes, the theatrical elements, those we consigned to silence and discretion. Webb had opened a concealed passage in the chamber's far wall, another of those cunningly hidden doors that seemed to honeycomb these depths, like chambers in a vast stone heart. This way leads directly to the vault level, he explained, ushering Blackwood toward the opening. I'll see Sir Edmund safely there and ensure the documents are properly restored before returning to guide you gentlemen back to the surface through conventional routes. They disappeared into the passage, the darkness swallowing them completely within moments, leaving Holmes, Lord Ashworth, and myself alone in the Foundation chamber as the approaching voices grew louder still, now accompanied by the sound of multiple footsteps echoing through the stone corridors that led to this ancient space. Holmes straightened his clothing, brushing away dust and moisture that had accumulated during our descent, transforming himself from mysterious investigator in ceremonial robes back to the consulting detective of Baker Street through simple adjustments of posture and expression. Lord Ashworth, he said, his tone carrying gentle instruction. When they arrive, you will explain that you engaged my services to investigate the missing documents and the disturbing letters you received. Watson and I followed leads that suggested the theft involved knowledge of these lower passages, and we were exploring them when we became temporarily disoriented in the maze of corridors. Nothing more complex than that. The truth, merely edited for brevity and discretion. Our client nodded, gathering his own composure with visible effort, squaring his shoulders against the weight of secrets he now carried, knowledge that would burden him through whatever years remained of his government service. The voices were very close now, and moments later 3 figures emerged into the Foundation chamber, their electric torches cutting harsh white beams through the softer glow of our remaining lanterns. I recognized one of them immediately, Lord Chancellor Pemberton, the third official with access to the sealed vault. His distinguished features set in an expression of concern that transformed to relief upon seeing Lord Ashworth unharmed. The other 2 were security personnel, solid men in dark uniforms, who assessed our small group with professional wariness before apparently deciding we posed no immediate threat. "Ashworth," Pemberton exclaimed, moving forward with the careful steps of one unused to navigating rough stone floors in official footwear. "When you failed to return from your evening visit to the office, and we found evidence of your descent to the lower levels, I feared. Well, I hardly know what I feared, but finding you safe eases considerable anxiety." His eyes moved to Holmes and myself, curiosity replacing concern. And these gentlemen would be Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson, Lord Ashworth replied, his voice steady now, the role he needed to play settling over him like familiar clothing. "I engaged them to investigate the theft of the documents and the peculiar letters I have been receiving. Their investigation led them to suspect that whoever took the papers possessed detailed knowledge of these underground passages, so we were exploring possible routes the thief might have used." Pemberton's expression shifted through several emotions. Surprise at Lord Ashworth's initiative in hiring private investigators. concern about security implications, and finally something approaching approval. A sensible approach, given the circumstances, he acknowledged. Though I wish you had consulted with Sir Edmund or myself before venturing into these depths. These passages are poorly mapped and potentially hazardous. We had Webb as guide. Holmes interjected smoothly, gesturing vaguely toward the passage through which the old keeper had departed. He was showing us the extent of the underground network when we became somewhat turned around in the maze of corridors. I believe we are currently several levels below the official basement areas, in sections that predate the modern structures entirely. One of the security officers had been examining the Foundation chamber with evident unease, his torch beam playing across the symbol-covered walls and the raised platform at the chamber's centre. "Sir," he addressed Pemberton, "should these areas be documented? I was unaware such chambers existed beneath Whitehall." "Historical remnants," the Lord Chancellor replied with the casual dismissiveness of one accustomed to accepting institutional mysteries without excessive curiosity. "Roman foundations, possibly earlier. The building department maintains basic records, though detailed exploration has never been deemed necessary. These spaces serve no current function beyond occasional storage of archival materials." Holmes caught my eye, and I saw in that brief glance acknowledgement of how easily truth could be hidden beneath layers of institutional incuriosity. How secrets persisted, not through elaborate conspiracies, but simply through the natural human tendency to accept official explanations and avoid investigating matters that lay outside one's immediate responsibilities. "In any case," Pemberton continued, "we should return to the surface. The hour grows late, and I have news regarding the missing documents that will interest you, Ashworth. Sir Edmund Blackwood discovered them this evening during a routine audit of the vault. They had apparently been misfiled in an adjacent storage cabinet, an error that, while embarrassing, resolves the crisis we feared we faced." Lord Ashworth's expression of relief required no theatrical skill, for it was entirely genuine. Relief not at the document's recovery, which he had known was imminent, but at the smoothness with which Blackwood's return of the papers had been executed and accepted. "That is welcome news indeed," he said, "and perhaps indicates that my fears regarding the letters and symbols were overblown, products of stress and imagination rather than genuine threat." "Perhaps," Holmes murmured, though his tone suggested he entertained private reservations about such convenient dismissals. "Though I would still recommend reviewing security protocols for the vault and investigating how those letters appeared in secured locations. Even if the document theft proves benign, the letters themselves suggest someone with considerable access and concerning knowledge of your movements and vulnerabilities." We began the long ascent back toward the surface world, guided now by the security officers who knew the most direct routes through the underground maze. The journey passed in relative silence, each of us occupied with private thoughts about what we had experienced in those depths, about mysteries resolved and others merely reframed, about the strange intersection of reason and belief we had witnessed in the Foundation chamber. When we finally emerged into Lord Ashworth's office, the same room where our investigation had begun hours earlier, though it felt like days had passed, the familiar surroundings seemed almost alien, as though we had travelled so far from normalcy that returning to it required a period of readjustment. The gas lamps burned with their steady, familiar light. The leather-bound books stood in their orderly rows, and through the windows the rain had finally ceased, leaving London's streets washed clean beneath a sky beginning to show the first grey hints of approaching dawn. Pemberton departed, after ensuring Lord Ashworth was well and extracting promises that future investigations would be conducted through proper channels. The security officers followed, leaving the three of us alone with the weight of secrets that would bind us together, regardless of how our paths might diverge in days to come. "Mr. Holmes," Lord Ashworth said quietly, moving to pour brandy from a decanter on his desk. "I find myself unsure whether to thank you for resolving my crisis or curse you for burdening me with knowledge I cannot share, and questions I cannot answer. The rational part of my mind insists that what Blackwood showed us was elaborate theatre, psychological manipulation dressed in mystical trappings. Yet another part, a deeper part I did not know existed until tonight, wonders if perhaps there are indeed more things in heaven and earth than my philosophy had dreamed." Holmes accepted the offered brandy, holding the glass up to catch the lamplight, watching the amber liquid glow like captured sunshine. "I would suggest," he said thoughtfully, "that the truth likely lies between the poles of absolute skepticism and uncritical belief. Whether supernatural protections exist or not, the principles Blackwood described, the institutional practices he claims derive from Dee's foundations, may well have pragmatic value independent of their supposed mystical origins. Tradition often preserves wisdom that its practitioners no longer fully understand, encoding in ritual and custom insights that remain valid even when their original justifications have been forgotten." He sipped the brandy, savouring it with the appreciation of one whose night of exertion had earned such comfort. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it does not matter whether Dee truly bound spiritual forces to Britain's protection, as long as the practices he established continue to serve the realm's interests through purely material mechanisms. The keepers preserve something valuable, regardless of whether they correctly understand what that something is. We remained in Lord Ashworth's office as dawn broke over London, watching light gradually fill the streets beyond the windows, transforming the city from a realm of shadows and gas lamps to the familiar daylight world of commerce and empire, of hansoms and newspaper sellers, of ordinary concerns proceeding in blessed ignorance of mysteries that dwelt beneath their feet. Webb appeared eventually to guide us out through conventional exits, and I noted how seamlessly he had already resumed his role as simple maintenance keeper, all trace of his deeper knowledge hidden behind a mask of institutional invisibility, more effective than any bronze facade. Holmes and I rode back to Baker Street in the grey morning light, neither of us speaking much, both occupied with processing what we had witnessed and what it might mean. The streets were beginning to fill with early workers, with milk wagons and street sweepers, with all the mundane mechanisms that kept a great city functioning, unaware and unconcerned with questions about foundations and protections, about ancient ceremonies and modern skepticism. Mrs. Hudson greeted us at the door with tea and concern about our night-long absence, and the familiar warmth of our rooms felt like the most profound luxury after hours in cold stone passages. Holmes settled into his chair before the fire, which Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully maintained in our absence, and filled his pipe with the deliberate care of one performing a meditative ritual. "Watson," he said, as smoke began to curl toward the ceiling, "I suspect we shall never know with certainty whether Sir Edmund Blackwood is a guardian of legitimate mystical protections, or merely a sincere believer in elegant fictions, but I find myself hoping, against my own rationalist inclinations, that there is something to his claims, some truth in the idea that the work of brilliant minds centuries ago continues to shield us through mechanisms we have not yet learned to perceive or measure. I settled into my own chair, feeling exhaustion finally claiming its due, my eyes growing heavy as the fire's warmth and the comfort of familiar surroundings worked their own gentle magic. Perhaps, I murmured, the greatest protection is simply the continuity itself. The fact that generations of people have believed these principles worth preserving, have built their institutions upon them, have maintained practices whose value transcends their ability to fully explain them. Holmes nodded, his eyes distant with thought, and we sat in companionable silence as morning brightened beyond our windows, and London awakened to another day of empire and industry, unaware that beneath its streets lay chambers where the past remained eternally present, where symbols carved in stone still held meaning for those few who knew where to look and how to interpret what they found. The mystery of the demon of Whitehall had been resolved, though like all the best mysteries, its resolution raised as many questions as it answered. The documents were restored, the letters explained, the impossible thefts given rational, or at least plausible, explanation. What remained were deeper mysteries that would never fully yield to investigation. Questions about belief and reality, reason and wonder, the visible and the hidden foundations upon which all certainty ultimately rests. And perhaps, as sleep finally claimed me there in my chair by the Baker Street fire, perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Some mysteries preserved rather than solved, some questions honored rather than answered, allowing the world to retain depth and possibility beyond what mere reason can encompass or explain. If you have found some measure of peace or wonder in this tale of Holmes and mysteries beneath London streets, I would be grateful if you would like this story. Subscribe to see more such investigations into the strange corners where Victorian reason encounters ancient mystery. Sleep well, dear listener, wherever in this wide world you find yourself. May your dreams carry you to places as intriguing as the Foundation Chamber, and may you wake refreshed, having travelled in imagination through depths that required no descent, save that gentle falling into sleep. That is itself a kind of mystery, a kind of magic we perform every night without fully understanding how consciousness releases its grip and allows us to drift into other realms entirely. Good night, and rest well.